Welcome to Whispers of History, where forgotten tales, strange events, and mysterious moments from the past come alive. One whisper at a time. Subscribe, relax, and let the past whisper you to sleep. The birth of a royal child was usually a spectacle. Within the palaces of Europe, such moments carried enormous weight. The future of entire dynasties rested upon the arrival of a healthy heir. In grand halls, preparations were made, bells ready to toll, messengers waiting to run through the city streets, heralds poised to proclaim the joyous news. But when a child was born with features that did not fit expectations, softer eyes, a gentler structure of the face, or a body that seemed more delicate, the tone of celebration changed. What was meant to be a moment of public triumph often shifted into something more muted, more private. Instead of fanfare, the corridors filled with whispers. Midwives exchanged uncertain glances. Courtiers, who would normally rush to spread tidings of a new prince or princess, hesitated. They were unsure of what words to use, or if words should be spoken at all. In many cases, the birth might not even be announced with full clarity. Chroniclers were known to write vague statements such as, "The queen was delivered of a child, but it did not thrive." Sometimes, the infant was described only in passing, as if the fewer words used, the less weight the moment carried. This quietness was not cruelty in its purest form, but it was born of fear. For kings and queens, a child was more than a child. They were hope, security, the continuation of bloodlines carefully woven through alliances and treaties. And when a newborn did not meet the narrow standard of strength, doubts could ripple through the realm. Behind closed doors, however, the atmosphere was often very different. While politics demanded discretion, the human heart did not always follow such rules. A mother, holding her child close, might see not a problem, but a fragile soul needing care. Fathers, too, experienced a range of emotions. Some were harsh, seeing only weakness in a child born different. But others, particularly those who had seen the loss of many infants, felt compassion in quieter ways. Royal households were no strangers to grief. Infant mortality was high, even among the privileged. To some, any child who survived those first fragile days was a gift, regardless of outward differences. Still, despite personal affection, the larger machinery of monarchy demanded control. Birth announcements were carefully worded. Midwives were often sworn to silence. Even paintings of royal families were adjusted. Artists knew how to soften or erase features that patrons did not want remembered. Thus, the existence of children born with Down syndrome, and other conditions, slipped into the margins of history. Rarely were they mentioned by name. Instead, they lived out their earliest days under a veil of obscurity, yet within those veils, there was still life. Imagine a royal nursery, carved cradles lined with silks, lullabies hummed by wet nurses, sunlight falling across tapestries. For the child, these were the same comforts and sensations experienced by any newborn. For the mother, too, there may have been a quiet joy in seeing the child respond to her touch, to hear small cries and feel the warmth of new life, but the quiet joy was always tempered by unspoken knowledge. Servants, trained to avoid questions, rarely mentioned the child's differences. Tutors, if assigned, were chosen carefully, not for their ability to prepare a future ruler, but to provide simple care, religious instruction, and gentle companionship. Sometimes, the birth of such a child was noted only in rumor, preserved not in official records but in private letters. Courtiers might write to relatives abroad, speaking obliquely of a child who is not suited to rule. These letters are often the only surviving threads that hint at lives hidden away. One can imagine the tension within the palace, the contrast between the silence in official halls and the small sounds of life in the nursery. A laugh, a cry, the coo of an infant, these human sounds did not disappear, even if they were not celebrated. For mothers, the grief was not always immediate. Many clung fiercely to their children, knowing they would soon be pressured to part from them. It was common practice to move such infants to private residences or monasteries, under the care of attendants. The first days of life, then, were precious, moments to memorize small details before separation, and so, these whispered births, shielded from public view, became a recurring pattern across European courts. Some children lived only a few months, passing before their presence could cause scandal. Others lived quietly for years, their names fading into silence. Still, their first days remind us of a truth: no matter how much silence surrounded them, they were still deeply human, still loved in hidden ways, and still part of the grand story of history, even if that story was written in hushed tones. As the days of infancy gave way to childhood, the questions grew larger. How should such a child be raised, and what did people at the time believe about their condition? These questions lead us naturally into the next chapter, the realm of medicine, where knowledge was limited, and explanations were often rooted more in superstition than in science. With this, the hushed chambers of birth fade into memory, and we step gently into the world of early medicine and misunderstanding, the second segment of our journey. In the centuries when royal children with Down syndrome were born, the world of medicine was very different from what we know today. Physicians and scholars tried to explain the mysteries of the human body, but their tools were limited, and their understanding of conditions like Down syndrome was shaped more by tradition and superstition than by science. The very language of medicine lacked a way to describe what they observed. A physician might note that a child appeared weak of constitution or slow of development. Midwives might speak softly of delicate features or gentle humors. These were phrases used to veil what they did not understand, and to protect both family and physician from blame. The prevailing theories of health in medieval and Renaissance Europe were built upon the system of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness, difference, or disability was thought to arise from an imbalance in these humors. If a child was born with certain features or appeared slow in development, physicians might claim the humors had been disturbed during pregnancy. Because of this framework, mothers were often blamed for such births. It was believed that emotions during pregnancy could shape the child. A moment of fright, sadness, or longing was thought to imprint itself upon the infant. A woman who gazed too long at an unusual object, or who endured sorrow during her term, might be accused of shaping her child's appearance through her mind. For the child themselves, medical care was minimal. Remedies might include herbal baths, charms, or prayers, intended not only to heal the body but to restore balance to the spirit. The line between medicine and religion was faint. Priests and physicians often worked side by side, offering both prayers and potions. At times, physicians recommended seclusion, believing quiet surroundings could restore balance. This advice aligned with the political need to hide such children from public life, and so medical opinion often reinforced royal secrecy. A physician might insist that the child remain in a calm household away from court for their health, when in truth it also served dynastic protection. As centuries passed, some observers began to record descriptions that, to modern eyes, unmistakably reflect Down syndrome. In the 17th and 18th centuries, there are rare notes of children with rounded faces, eyes turned upward, and gentle demeanor. These were not recognized as a distinct condition, but simply as part of the spectrum of human difference. Still, because medical knowledge was limited, such children were often viewed through moral or spiritual lenses. Some believed they were closer to angels, blessed with purity and innocence. Others saw them as burdens, trials sent by God to test the faith of a family. Both views, though opposite in tone, placed the child outside the realm of ordinary life, set apart from others. The courts themselves sometimes leaned on astrology. The stars were thought to influence health and fortune. If a child was born under unusual alignments, astrologers might link their features or development to celestial patterns. Charts were drawn, predictions whispered. And parents reassured or warned depending on the interpretation, yet, amidst these layers of misunderstanding, there were moments of quiet recognition. Some nurses and caregivers, who spent hours with such children, came to know them not as symbols of imbalance or omens, but simply as children, affectionate, playful, and capable of joy. These caretakers often left no written records, but their actions, gentle teaching, comforting presence, formed a silent history of love that counterbalanced the weight of medical ignorance. In some cases, royal physicians offered practical advice, such as exercise or diet. A child might be encouraged to walk in gardens, drink special broths, or rest in sunlight. These remedies rarely altered outcomes, but they show that not all care was dismissive. Even with limited knowledge, there was effort, however imperfect, to nurture. The tragedy lay not in the absence of affection, but in the absence of understanding. Without the medical framework we have today, these children were forever caught between superstition and silence. They were not recognized as having a specific condition, but instead explained away as divine will, maternal influence, or astrological fate. It was not until the 19th century that physicians began to formally describe the condition we now call Down syndrome. But in the centuries before, countless royal children lived their lives without the dignity of recognition, their uniqueness unrecorded by the medical world. When we look back, we must remember that silence is not absence. These children existed, and though medical knowledge could not name them, their presence left quiet imprints in the lives of those who cared for them. The sound of their laughter, the small comfort they gave to mothers, the patience they inspired in tutors, all of these are part of the hidden history, and so, the story of medicine in this era is not only about what was misunderstood, but also about what was felt. It was about attempts, however misguided, to explain, to heal, to comfort. And it was about the tension between official silence and private tenderness. With this, we step gently out of the world of physicians and into the world of politics, where the fate of these children was not determined by health alone, but by the shadow of succession and the weight of dynastic expectation. When a royal child was born, every gaze turned immediately to one question: could this child inherit the throne? In kingdoms where dynasties rose and fell on bloodlines, the body of an infant was more than flesh and spirit. It was the vessel of continuity, the hope of stability, the anchor of a nation's future. But for children with Down syndrome, that hope became clouded in silence and secrecy. The laws of succession varied across Europe, but they shared one unyielding principle: a monarch must appear strong, capable, and legitimate. Any sign of fragility was feared as weakness. Thus, a child born with visible differences or developmental delays was rarely considered a secure heir. Behind closed doors, counselors debated, whispered, and sometimes panicked. If the firstborn son, the long-awaited heir, was born with Down syndrome, the stability of the kingdom seemed suddenly fragile. Would rivals challenge the throne? Would factions form? These fears often outweighed compassion. In some cases, younger siblings were elevated in place of the affected child. The public was rarely told the truth. Official records might say the older child had died in infancy, even if they lived on in quiet seclusion. Succession demanded a clear story, and ambiguity was a threat to order. This secrecy created a strange duality. The child was loved within the private world of family and caregivers, but erased in the public record of dynasties. Their names rarely appeared in chronicles. Their faces were rarely painted in official portraits. It was as though they lived two lives, one tender and hidden, one absent and silent. Some rulers struggled with this reality more than others. A queen might cling to her child with fierce love, resisting political pressure to send them away. A king might feel torn between paternal affection and dynastic duty. These personal conflicts rarely entered official records, but they echo in faint rumors, letters, and whispered chronicles. The image of kingship was deeply tied to ideals of strength and control. Monarchs were symbols of divine order on earth. To present a child who did not embody those ideals was seen as risky, even dangerous. And so, the very existence of these children threatened not only the line of succession but the symbolic order of monarchy itself. Yet, in the privacy of nurseries and hidden estates, these children lived their own lives, small but meaningful. They learned to walk, to laugh, to play, to love, just as any child would. The tragedy lies not in their inability to rule, but in the way history erased their stories, as if a crown was the only measure of a life's worth. Occasionally, whispers broke through. Chroniclers noted an heir of frail mind or a prince unsuited for governance. Such phrases were deliberately vague, cloaking the truth in respectful silence. To speak too clearly risked scandal, rebellion, or questions about divine favor. The consequences of these decisions shaped entire kingdoms. If an heir was bypassed, wars of succession could erupt. Nobles might question legitimacy, foreign rulers might invade, and dynasties might fracture. The private fate of a single child could ripple outward, shaking nations, but within palaces, behind guarded walls, the personal story continued quietly. A nurse soothing a child to sleep. A mother teaching them simple prayers. A sibling sneaking into the nursery to play. These human moments existed alongside the heavy politics of succession, though the world beyond never saw them. Sometimes, the tension between love and duty surfaced in symbolic art. A tapestry might depict a garden with both blooming flowers and shaded blossoms. A court poem might speak of a star hidden behind clouds. These were discreet ways to acknowledge what could not be spoken openly. The shadow of succession hung over every royal child, but for those born with Down syndrome, it was a heavier burden. Their lives were measured not by their own joys or struggles, but by the crown they would never wear, and yet, when we pause and look past dynastic politics, a different truth emerges. These children were not symbols, nor burdens, nor threats. They were simply children, deserving of love, capable of giving it, and quietly shaping the hearts of those who cared for them. In this way, the shadow of succession tells us as much about the fragility of kingdoms as it does about the resilience of children. Thrones may tremble, dynasties may fall, but affection endures in small, private acts. For most royal children, life within a palace was a spectacle of pageantry. Trumpets greeted their birth, tutors trained their minds, and courtiers admired their every movement as signs of a future ruler. But for those born with Down syndrome, life took another path, quieter, hidden, and often softened by shadows. The presence of these children at court was often fleeting. In the earliest months, they might still be displayed as part of a happy family tableau. But as they grew, and differences became more apparent, subtle changes occurred. Their time in public spaces diminished. Their appearances at ceremonies dwindled. Soon, the rhythm of their days no longer matched that of their siblings. While brothers attended lessons in rhetoric or swordplay, and sisters learned the arts of diplomacy or embroidery, these children were given gentler routines. Walks in gardens. Simple songs. Quiet afternoons with caretakers rather than tutors. Rooms within great palaces were reconfigured into sanctuaries of seclusion. Tapestries muffled noise. Windows were veiled to soften light. The chambers of these children became cocoons, places where their laughter could be heard only by a chosen few, where their play unfolded away from the gaze of the court. Despite their isolation, they were not without affection. Many accounts hint at the quiet bonds formed with nurses, governesses, and attendants. These relationships, while unrecorded in official chronicles, left imprints of deep tenderness. Still, separation from the wider court had consequences. Brothers and sisters, though often affectionate, were encouraged to distance themselves. The narrative of succession required clarity, and a child living in shadow could not complicate that image. Over time, they became a secret known but unspoken, a presence felt but rarely acknowledged. Yet within those quiet rooms, a kind of alternate childhood flourished. These children may not have worn crowns or recited speeches, but they had moments of joy, chasing light on the walls, humming along with lullabies, clasping hands with caretakers. Their worlds were smaller, but not devoid of meaning. Sometimes, visitors to the court whispered about the hidden child. A foreign ambassador might notice a small figure disappearing down a hallway. A court artist might glimpse them playing in a garden. These sightings became fragments of rumor, woven into foreign reports as curiosities. Their lives also reveal the paradox of monarchy. The palace was both a place of immense power and immense constraint. A royal child might be surrounded by silks and gold, yet their days were narrower than those of common children beyond the gates. They were hidden not by poverty, but by fear of perception. Within these secluded spaces, caregivers often became the child's entire world. Letters from attendants, though rare, suggest quiet affection, remarks about a child's gentle nature, a fondness for music, or a sweet patience in play. These glimpses remind us that even in shadow, love could thrive. At times, these children were moved from the palace altogether, placed in estates far from the center of power. There, surrounded by countryside and fewer eyes, they could live with less scrutiny. Records of such arrangements are fragmentary, but suggest a pattern of secrecy balanced with a measure of safety. The sadness lies not only in the hiding, but in the silence of memory. These children rarely appeared in family portraits. Chronicles described their siblings' triumphs and marriages, but seldom their own lives. It is as though their presence dissolved into the shadows where they once lived. And yet, we must imagine them, not as shadows, but as children whose lives had rhythms of laughter, rest, curiosity, and care. They may not have walked the bright halls of diplomacy or ceremony, but they walked gardens, whispered secrets to attendants, and carried small joys through days of quiet routine. Their exclusion teaches us something profound about monarchy itself. The crown was never only about ruling, it was about appearing invulnerable, flawless, ordained. And so, children who revealed the vulnerability of human life were hidden, not because they were unloved, but because they did not fit the fragile story kings and queens told about themselves. Thus, the lives of these children became testaments to both tenderness and absence. Their days were filled with affection in private, but their names seldom echoed in history. To remember them now is to bring light into the quiet corners where they once lived, to honor their humanity alongside the crowns that overshadowed them. Behind every royal child with Down syndrome, hidden in the folds of dynastic secrecy, there were always companions, quiet figures who gave shape to their days. These caregivers rarely appear in chronicles, yet their devotion filled the hidden spaces where history turned its face away. While kings ruled and queens counseled, it was the nurses, governesses, and attendants who spent long hours beside these children. They dressed them, fed them, guided their steps, and listened to their laughter. In those chambers muffled from public life, these caregivers were more than servants. They became surrogate parents, protectors, and friends. The bond between caregiver and child was often one of quiet endurance. These children were not destined for thrones, but they were still precious lives in need of affection. Caregivers often described them as gentle, affectionate, and eager for companionship. In their presence, the burdens of court intrigue gave way to simple acts of human connection. Many of these attendants were chosen for their patience. They were women of quiet temperament, often widows or older servants, trusted to offer constancy. For them, the child was not a puzzle or a burden but a soul to be cherished. Within these private bonds, the children found stability in a world that otherwise erased them. The rhythm of their companionship was not marked by politics but by daily rituals. Morning walks in palace gardens. Afternoon lessons in simple songs or prayers. Evening lullabies whispered beneath velvet curtains. These rituals shaped lives of dignity and calm, even when history refused to acknowledge them. Often, siblings drifted in and out of these hidden spaces. Some grew deeply attached to their brother or sister, sneaking into nurseries for stolen play. Others, trained to focus on the crown's weight, were gently distanced. In this way, caregivers became even more central, filling the emotional spaces siblings could not always occupy. Caregivers themselves bore the paradox of secrecy. They loved openly, but were asked to remain silent. They tended to children who were erased from portraits and records, yet their daily affection was unwavering. This duality required strength, to nurture what the world chose not to see. Some accounts suggest that these attendants gave small tokens of affection, a handmade toy, a carved charm, or a lullaby remembered from their own childhoods. These gestures, modest but heartfelt, became treasures for the child who received them. The importance of these bonds cannot be overstated. While kingship measured worth in crowns, caregivers measured worth in smiles, in steady breathing during sleep. In tiny victories, a new word spoken, a gentle embrace returned. Through them, these children experienced lives of affection that politics could neither erase nor tarnish. In some cases, lifelong attachments formed. Even as the child grew into adolescence, attendants remained nearby. They guided, soothed, and shielded them from the harsher gaze of the outside world. Such loyalty, though seldom recorded, likely carried through decades, weaving invisible threads of constancy. The lives of caregivers also reveal something about compassion itself. In a world where dynastic ambition often overshadowed humanity, they quietly upheld the dignity of lives others preferred to ignore. Their care did not alter the course of kingdoms, but it altered the course of hearts. Sometimes, caregivers faced subtle scorn. Other courtiers saw their work as less prestigious, tending to a child who would never rule. Yet within that humble role was a profound truth. They embodied the quiet love that dynasties often lacked. Their devotion was not tied to crowns or thrones, but to the simple dignity of a human life. These bonds remind us that history's silence is not the same as absence. Though names may be missing from chronicles, the daily gestures of companionship, hands held, lullabies sung, tears soothed, created lives of meaning. In remembering caregivers, we also remember the children they tended. For every shadowed story of secrecy, there is also a story of devotion. For every erased name, there is a bond that endured quietly, without recognition, yet with unmeasurable depth. Thus, when we look back, it is not only the rulers who deserve memory, but the companions who gave these children comfort. Their lives remind us that even in the quietest corners of history, love endured, steady and unrecorded, a candle glowing where the world saw only shadow. In the quiet chambers of royal courts, faith was never far away. For children born with Down syndrome, religion shaped not only how they were cared for but also how they were understood. Their lives were framed through sacred texts, prayers, and the silence of chapels, where whispered interpretations often carried more weight than medicine. Clergy in earlier centuries struggled to interpret difference. Some voices, steeped in superstition, saw disability as divine punishment, a sign of ancestral sin or a test of the family's virtue. Others, more gentle, described these children as angelic, unburdened by worldly ambition, closer to God through innocence. These interpretations shaped whether the child was cherished or concealed. A compassionate priest might encourage the family to see the child as a blessing, a soul entrusted to them for special care. A harsher court chaplain might whisper of divine displeasure, deepening secrecy and shame. Religious rituals, however, were constants. Baptism was never denied, for even the most secretive courts knew the soul must be welcomed into the Christian fold. These ceremonies, though often private, placed the child into the same covenant of faith as their siblings, affirming their worth in the eyes of God. Beyond baptism, prayers were a lifeline. Nannies, mothers, and even siblings were known to whisper petitions at bedside, that the child would sleep peacefully, that their health would endure, that they would be spared the harsh judgments of others. The theology of suffering also touched these children's lives. In some traditions, suffering was seen as a means of purification, a pathway through which families might learn humility and compassion. While troubling by modern eyes, this belief gave meaning to lives that otherwise risked dismissal in dynastic calculations. There were also stories of comfort. Some chaplains wrote of children with cognitive differences who seemed attuned to prayer, humming during hymns or staring with unusual serenity at candle flames. These small signs were interpreted as evidence of closeness to the divine, a reassurance to families that the child carried a sacred aura. At times, religious interpretation softened what politics made hard. When dynasties worried about appearances, chaplains could remind them that souls, not crowns, mattered most before God. These gentle voices created pockets of acceptance, even as silence reigned in the broader historical record. Still, religion could also justify exclusion. Monastic houses occasionally became the quiet destination for children deemed unsuitable for court life. There, within stone walls, their days followed the rhythm of bells and prayer, far from public sight yet always within the embrace of faith. Such settings provided stability. Within cloisters, these children were not heirs or embarrassments but simply souls in need of care. Monks and nuns offered companionship, spiritual lessons, and a structured routine, a different kind of court, where crowns mattered less than quiet devotion. Religious festivals, too, gave these children moments of joy. Feast days filled cloisters and palaces with music, candles, and color. Even if their role was limited, the sights and sounds provided an atmosphere of belonging, however fleeting, from the pulpit to the nursery. Interpretations varied, yet all pointed to a central truth: religion gave language where politics faltered. Faith explained what crowns could not, assigning meaning to lives that dynasties often refused to name. The comfort drawn from these interpretations lingers even now. Families who mourned or hid their children could still whisper to themselves that God understood, that divine compassion extended beyond what human society allowed. Through religion, secrecy became bearable, if not justified. Through rituals and prayers, children excluded from worldly recognition were promised eternal recognition before God. It was here, in the quiet sanctuaries of faith, that they found dignity denied elsewhere, and so, in reflecting on their lives, we glimpse both sides of faith, its power to console, and its power to confine. Yet even in confinement, devotion carried these children, reminding the world that worth is not measured in crowns, but in the eternal quiet of the soul. While much of Europe shared similar dynastic anxieties about children born with differences, the ways in which these children were regarded also varied by region, shaped by cultural traditions, philosophies, and inherited customs. To understand their fate more fully, we must step across borders, from France to Spain, from England to Russia, and beyond, tracing how each royal court responded in its own way. In France, the emphasis on grandeur and continuity of monarchy often led to silence. French courts valued image above all, polishing the mirror of royal perfection. Children with Down syndrome were rarely mentioned in chronicles, not because they did not exist, but because they did not fit the ideal of the radiant Bourbon dynasty. In England, attitudes fluctuated across time. Some monarchs concealed children entirely, while others, guided by personal temperament or religious conviction, allowed them modest visibility within private life. The English tradition of household chronicles sometimes recorded weakly children, though seldom by name, hinting at their existence without celebration. Spain's Catholic courts infused their attitudes with religious meaning. While concealment remained common, Spanish chroniclers occasionally described children as angelitos, little angels. This language reflected Catholic devotion, framing disability as spiritual innocence, though it also reinforced the sense that such children did not belong in worldly affairs. In contrast, Russia's Orthodox tradition created a slightly different context. Within Russian belief, the Holy Fool, the Urodovy, was seen as a figure close to God, blessed with innocence and divine insight. Although royal children were rarely placed in this category, the cultural backdrop softened attitudes, making difference less a mark of shame and more a sign of spiritual mystery. Northern European courts, like those in Scandinavia, often reflected Lutheran practicality. Records suggest fewer ornate theological interpretations, but also less tolerance in dynastic matters. Such children were often quietly placed in rural estates, where they lived under the care of trusted attendants, away from the central glare of royal scrutiny. The Ottoman Empire approached disability through different cultural frameworks. Though royal succession there was brutal and pragmatic, children with disabilities sometimes escaped the lethal struggles for power precisely because they posed no political threat. Within palace harems, they could be cared for by devoted women and attendants. Folded into private domestic spaces, in East Asia, Confucian ideals in imperial China stressed harmony and filial piety. Records of children with Down syndrome are scarce, but the philosophy of duty meant families bore responsibility for their care, even if they were excluded from the rituals of succession. In Japan, influenced by Shinto and Buddhist perspectives, disability could be seen as karmic but also as spiritually significant. Within noble families, such children were often kept from public duties but not always erased from private memory. Monastic retreats, too, offered spaces of quiet refuge. Across Africa, the lens shifts again. In certain royal traditions, difference could be interpreted as a spiritual mark, with roles assigned within ritual contexts rather than erased. Although documentation is less detailed, oral histories suggest that children born different were sometimes thought to hold protective or prophetic qualities. Cultural context shaped not only perception but daily reality. In some courts, children lived cloistered lives, shielded from public view. In others, they were gently included in household rituals, small presences in banquets, festivals, or prayers. Each culture balanced between shame and tenderness, secrecy and care. Even in their concealment, these children reflected the priorities of their cultures. Where dynasties prized strength and succession, silence reigned. Where faith or philosophy softened harshness, a glimmer of tenderness appeared. Yet in all places, their lives remind us of the tension between human compassion and the demands of power. When we step back, we see not a single story but a mosaic. Cultural attitudes shaped how these children were remembered, or forgotten. Yet through all differences, a common thread emerges. Their presence unsettled the ideals of royal perfection, forcing courts to choose between humanity and image, and though dynasties often chose silence, we can still sense the echoes, lullabies sung in French nurseries, whispered prayers in Spanish chapels, long walks in Russian cloisters, or quiet evenings in Ottoman harems. Cultural variations shaped details, but the deeper truths remained universal. In remembering them, across regions and traditions, we are reminded that compassion is not bound by borders. Though history concealed them, love and care found expression in every culture, carried quietly across time. Silence was perhaps the most powerful tool of royal courts. It was not only what was spoken that shaped history, but what was deliberately left unsaid. For children born with Down syndrome, this silence became their most enduring legacy, a hush that followed them through palaces, nurseries, and the archives of time. Royal families mastered the art of omission. Official genealogies were polished like mirrors, reflecting only strength and perfection. In such mirrors, there was no room for children who did not fit dynastic ideals. Their names, if written at all, were tucked into private documents, never into chronicles meant for public eyes. This silence served many purposes. It preserved the image of the dynasty as unbroken, unmarred. It shielded rulers from gossip and doubt. And it allowed succession to appear uncontested, as though no life existed beyond the strong, the able, the crowned. Yet silence is not emptiness. It is an act of control. By omitting, dynasties shaped the narrative of themselves, crafting perfection through absence. And in that absence, the children were doubly hidden, unseen in life, and unremembered in death. Occasionally, traces of truth slipped through. A passing mention in a letter. A nurse's quiet note. A physician's diagnosis scribbled at the edge of a page. These fragments whisper across time, reminders that silence was not complete, that humanity has always resisted erasure. The language of silence extended beyond documents. Portraits omitted these children, ensuring that future generations would see only an unbroken chain of strong heirs. While siblings were painted in silks and jewels, the hidden child might exist only in memory, absent from canvases meant to immortalize. Court gossip, too, played its part. Servants and attendants often knew of these children, but discretion was demanded. To speak openly risked dismissal or punishment. Thus, silence became both shield and prison, protecting dynasties, while confining lives. For mothers, silence carried particular weight. To be told not to speak of one's own child was a burden beyond measure. Some expressed their grief through private devotion, commissioning chapels, or offering prayers that lingered long after the dynasty's voice had faded. Silence also shaped memory across generations. Descendants, unaware of missing names, grew up believing in the myth of perfection. Dynasties became legends of strength, their fragility erased by careful omission. Only much later, with the work of historians, did the silences begin to unravel. Even today, archives reveal gaps that speak louder than words. When we find blank spaces in genealogies, or medical notes with only initials, we are listening to the echo of silence itself. History, like memory, is shaped as much by what is left out as by what is preserved, and yet, silence cannot erase humanity. Behind every omission was a living child who laughed, cried, and held the hands of those who loved them. The silence, however heavy, cannot undo their existence. It can only remind us of the cost of image over truth. Silence also teaches us about power. To control the record is to control the future. Dynasties knew this well, and in their pursuit of perfection, they chose silence as their ally. Yet their silence is also their confession, for every omission reveals fear, and every blank space speaks of vulnerability. Today, when we rediscover these silences, we offer a quiet correction. By naming, by remembering, we restore humanity to those who were denied it. In this act, we also soften history's edges, filling silence not with noise, but with gentle acknowledgement. The language of silence in dynasties is not a relic. It is a mirror, showing us how societies still decide whose stories to tell, and whose to leave unsaid. To learn from it is to choose compassion over omission, truth over perfection. In remembering these children now, we break the silence that bound them. We acknowledge their lives, however brief, however hidden, and allow their presence to echo softly across the centuries. When we think about royal children with Down syndrome, it is tempting to use modern words, diagnoses, and frameworks. But in their own time, these children lived in a world without chromosomes, without genetic testing, without the language of modern medicine. Their conditions were observed, described, and often misunderstood, shaped by the limited science of each era. In the medieval period, health was explained through the balance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Any difference in appearance or behavior was seen as an imbalance of these fluids. Children born with Down syndrome, with their distinctive features and slower development, were often attributed to weakness of the humors. This explanation was not cruel in intent, but it lacked accuracy. Medicine, bound by tradition, sought patterns where science had not yet looked. Families might be told that their child's differences came from the mother's health during pregnancy, or even from celestial influences at the moment of birth. By the Renaissance, anatomy began to advance, yet understanding of genetic difference remained absent. Physicians recorded symptoms with more precision: weakness of mind, gentle disposition, unusual features. These words are found in private notes, echoing recognition without comprehension. The Enlightenment brought new curiosity. Scholars began to classify human variety. But their systems often reduced difference to categories of normal and abnormal. Children with Down syndrome might be placed under terms like idiocy or cretinism, words heavy with judgment, lacking compassion. Still, some medical observers described not only limitation but also gentleness. A few noted their affectionate temperament, their preference for music, their calm disposition. These observations, while filtered through archaic language, hinted at a recognition of humanity beyond diagnosis. The 19th century marked a shift. In 1866, Dr. John Langdon Down published his description of what he called Mongolian idiocy, an outdated and offensive term by modern standards, but one that recognized a consistent pattern. His observations provided the foundation for what we now know as Down syndrome. Langdon Down's work reached courts and physicians alike. For the first time, differences were not simply dismissed as random weakness. They were described systematically, though still misunderstood through racialized language. His observations acknowledged a group, but did not yet honor the individuality of each child. For royal families, these medical words offered both explanation and justification for secrecy. To have a diagnosis, however crude, gave structure to decisions already long practiced: concealment, removal from succession, quiet care in private spaces. Medicine gave language to silence. Without dismantling it, even as science advanced, care remained largely practical: attentive nurses, careful diets, protection from illness. Physicians could describe, but they could not cure. And so, the burden of care remained on the quiet devotion of attendants, more than on medical intervention. It was not until the 20th century that chromosomes revealed the true cause: a third copy of chromosome 21. This discovery, far beyond the lives of earlier royal children, brought clarity where silence had reigned. For them, however, the world of medicine remained one of half-answers, cloaked in uncertainty. Looking back, medical understanding reflects humanity's long struggle to explain difference. From humors to anatomy, from classification to chromosomes, each step reveals both progress and limitation. And within these steps, royal children were observed, described, and too often misunderstood. The silence of dynasties and the language of medicine worked together, one omitting, the other categorizing. Yet between them lay the child, breathing, laughing, needing love more than explanation. Medicine gave words, but affection gave life. Today, as we understand more, we see the gaps left by history. We read old descriptions not as verdicts but as echoes of lives who deserved names, not labels. Medicine has grown, but it is memory that restores their humanity. Thus, when we speak of medical understanding in history, we do not only trace the evolution of science. We also honor those who lived in the gap between explanation and compassion, children whose lives remind us that medicine, however advanced, is only one part of care. As our journey through the lives of royal children with Down syndrome draws to its close, it feels natural to pause and reflect. The shadows of secrecy, the limited medical understanding, and the quiet devotion of caregivers all belong to the past. And yet, their legacy reaches into the present, shaping the way we view history, medicine, and compassion. Today, Down syndrome is understood not as a curse, nor a mysterious imbalance, but as a chromosomal difference, a natural variation of human life. Where once royal families concealed, today families share stories openly, finding strength in community. This openness changes everything. The children once hidden in nurseries and side chambers are, in our era, placed at the center of family life, celebrated for their individuality. Each milestone, a first word, a favorite song, a warm hug, is seen not as a limitation, but as a joy. Medical care too has transformed. Where once physicians spoke vaguely of humors or weak constitutions, modern doctors can offer therapies, education, and long life expectancy. Down syndrome, while still presenting challenges, no longer means a life cut tragically short, and so, when we look back at royal children of the past, our hearts soften. We see not only the silence and sorrow, but the beginnings of a story that has grown into something larger. Their hidden lives remind us how far we have come, and how far compassion can reach. These reflections do not erase the tragedy. The silence of dynasties remains a wound, a reminder of lives not fully lived in the light. But in acknowledging them, in speaking their stories, we return dignity that history once denied. For modern royals, these lessons endure. The British royal family, for example, has publicly supported charities and initiatives for children with disabilities, gestures of recognition that might once have been impossible. Where silence reigned, acknowledgement now blooms. Across societies, awareness campaigns, education, and advocacy have turned what was once hidden into something seen, valued, and celebrated. Children with Down syndrome are not whispered secrets, they are classmates, co-workers, friends, and leaders in their communities. The contrast with the past is sharp. Where once physicians wrote in guarded tones, now parents write memoirs, educators publish guides, and children themselves share their voices. The quiet has become conversation, and yet, the memory of royal children remains poignant. Their lives remind us of the weight of perception, how society's view of difference can either diminish or embrace. They lived in eras where difference was feared. Today, we strive toward a world where it is welcomed. As we rest with these thoughts, imagine for a moment those royal nurseries of long ago. The tapestries still hang, the candle still flickers, and within that chamber a child sits quietly, a child who might have loved music, who might have laughed softly at the sight of a bird. Now, imagine their voice carried into our time, joining the chorus of children today. No longer hidden, no longer nameless, but remembered as part of the long human story of difference, resilience, and care. The legacy of these royal children, though born in silence, is one of transformation. They remind us that history is not only about kings and battles, but about small lives, fragile and precious, who shaped compassion in ways unseen. As you drift into rest, let the story settle gently, from secrecy to openness, from shadows to light. Their journey is not just theirs, it belongs to all who have been misunderstood, all who have waited for recognition, all who find dignity in being seen, and so, may their memory soften our world. May it remind us that every life, whether lived in silence or in song, carries worth. In honoring them, we honor ourselves, and we let history breathe more gently. Another whisper from the past, now fading into the night. Thanks for listening. Subscribe for more sleepy stories from history. And until next time,